The morning Josephine Abbott arrived in Nebraska City in the summer of 1872. She had a split lip and bruises darkening both her cheekbones like storm clouds gathering on pale skin. She climbed down from the dusty stagecoach with her few belongings clutched in a worn carpet bag, trying not to wince as her ribs protested the movement. The driver didn't offer to help her down, and she didn't expect him to. Men had been teaching her what to expect from them since she was old enough to remember. Nebraska City sprawled before her in the morning heat, a bustling river town where the Missouri River brought commerce and people from everywhere. The streets were crowded with freight wagons hauling goods westward, merchants calling out their wares, and the constant sound of hammers as new buildings rose to meet the demands of expansion. Josephine stood on the wooden sidewalk, squinting against the bright sun, wondering if she had made a terrible mistake coming here. But anywhere was better than St. Louis and the husband she had finally fled from in the middle of the night. She was 20 years old and felt ancient. Her father had been a drunk who took his frustrations out on her mother, until the day that woman died of a fever that might have been cured if he had bothered to fetch a doctor. Then he had turned his attention to Josephine, his words as brutal as his fists. When she was 18, she had married Thomas Abbott, thinking marriage would be her escape. Instead, she had traded one nightmare for another. Thomas had seemed charming during their brief courtship, but the charm evaporated the moment they were wed. For 2 years, she had endured his cruelty, his cutting words that made her feel smaller than dirt, his hands that left marks she learned to hide beneath long sleeves and high collars. Then one night, after he had beaten her badly enough that she could barely stand, she had waited until he passed out drunk and took what little money she could find. She had walked through the darkness to the stagecoach station and bought a ticket as far west as her coins would take her. Nebraska City was the end of that line, and so Nebraska City was where her new life would have to begin. Josephine made her way down the main street, keeping her head down, her bonnet pulled forward to hide her face. She needed to find work and a place to stay, though she had no idea how she would manage either. She had no references, no skills beyond basic housekeeping, and no friends in this town. The carpetbag grew heavy in her hand as she walked, and she tried to ignore the hollow feeling in her stomach. She had eaten nothing but a hard biscuit in the last day. A sign caught her eye. McCready's boarding house, clean rooms, fair rates. The building was 2 stories, painted white with green shutters, and looked respectable enough. Josephine gathered her courage and walked up the front steps. A bell jangled as she pushed open the door. The woman who appeared from a back room was middle-aged and sturdy, with graying hair pulled back in a severe bun. She took one look at Josephine's face, and her expression hardened. "We don't want trouble here." "I'm not trouble, madam," Josephine said quietly, hating how her voice shook. "I just need a room I can pay." She could pay for perhaps 3 nights if she was careful, and then she would have to figure something else out. The woman's eyes narrowed. "Where's your husband?" "I don't have one anymore. Ran away, did you?" The woman crossed her arms. "What did you do to make him so angry?" The words hit Josephine like a physical blow. "What did you do?" As if it had been her fault. As if she had somehow earned the beatings, the cruel words, the nights of terror. She felt something inside her go very cold and very still. "Nothing," she said, and her voice was steadier now. "I did nothing, but I can see this was a mistake. Good day." She turned and walked back out into the heat, her eyes burning but refusing to let the tears fall. She tried 2 more boarding houses and got the same response. By the time the sun was high overhead, Josephine was exhausted, hungry, and fighting despair. She found herself at the edge of town where the buildings gave way to open land. A small creek ran nearby, lined with cottonwood trees that offered shade. She sank down beneath one of the trees and finally let herself cry, quiet sobs that shook her bruised ribs and made her head ache worse. "You all right, miss?" Josephine's head jerked up. A woman stood a few feet away, youngish and plain-faced, wearing a simple calico dress. Her expression held genuine concern, which was so unexpected that Josephine didn't know how to respond. "I'm fine," she managed, wiping at her eyes. "You don't look fine." The woman came closer and sat down on a fallen log nearby. "My name's Martha Greene. I live just over that hill in a little soddy with my husband. We saw you come into town this morning on the stage." "Josephine," she said after a moment. "Josephine Abbott. Those bruises look painful." Josephine touched her face automatically, then dropped her hand. "They'll heal. I reckon they will." Martha was quiet for a moment. "Where are you planning to stay?" "I'm working on that. Mrs. McCready turned you away, didn't she? And probably Mrs. Henderson, too." "They're both cut from the same cloth." Martha shook her head. "Listen, I know someone who might be able to help. There's a man lives up in the hills west of here, traps and hunts, brings furs and meat into town to trade. Name's Samuel Zane, though most folks just call him the Mountain Man. He's got a big cabin up there, built it himself. He comes into town every couple weeks for supplies." "I don't see how that helps me," Josephine said carefully. "Well, last time he was here, he mentioned he could use someone to help with things at his cabin. Cooking, preserving food, mending, that sort of thing. Most women won't go up there because it's remote and he's a bit of an outsider. Keeps to himself mostly. But he's a good man, Samuel is. Honest and fair. Never heard a bad word about him except that he's too quiet for most folks' taste." Josephine felt a flicker of something that might have been hope, but she crushed it quickly. Hope was dangerous. "I couldn't impose on a stranger." "It wouldn't be imposing if you're working for him," Martha pointed out, "and he was serious about needing help. He'll be in town tomorrow, trading at Anderson's general store. You could talk to him then, see what you think." "Why are you helping me?" Josephine asked suddenly. "You don't know me." Martha's expression softened. "Because I can see you need help, and because I know what it's like when the world's not kind to you. My husband and I, we weren't always farmers, had some hard times before we settled here. Folks helped us when we needed it. Figure I should do the same when I can." Josephine felt her throat tighten. "Thank you. Don't thank me yet. Just meet Samuel tomorrow and see if it suits you both. In the meantime, you can't sleep under this tree. Come back to our place. It's not much, but we've got a spare bit of floor and some supper to share." The kindness was almost more than Josephine could bear after the harshness of the day. She nodded, not trusting herself to speak, and followed Martha back to the small sod house on the hillside. Martha's husband, a thin, quiet man named Henry, greeted her with a nod and didn't ask questions. They fed her stew and fresh bread, and she slept that night on a blanket near their small stove, more comfortable than she had been in months despite the hard floor. The next day, Martha took her into town. Anderson's general store was busy, full of people buying supplies and trading news. Martha pointed toward the back corner where a man stood talking with the storekeeper. Josephine's breath caught. Samuel Zane was enormous, easily over 6 feet tall with shoulders that seemed to fill the space around him. He had long, dark brown hair that reached past his collar, tied back roughly with a leather cord. His face was weathered and tanned from the sun, with a strong jaw covered in several days' worth of dark stubble. He wore buckskin pants and a simple homespun shirt with the sleeves rolled up, revealing forearms thick with muscle and covered in scars. Everything about him radiated strength and capability. "That's him," Martha whispered. "Come on." Josephine wanted to turn and run. The man looked intimidating, powerful, exactly the kind of man she had learned to fear. But Martha was already walking toward him, and Josephine forced herself to follow. "Samuel," Martha called out cheerfully. "Got a minute?" The big man turned, and Josephine saw his eyes. They were a startling gray-green, clear and direct, and when they landed on her, they were careful rather than aggressive. He looked at her bruised face without expression, then shifted his gaze back to Martha. "Morning, Martha," he said. His voice was deep and quiet, surprisingly gentle coming from such a large man. "What can I do for you? This is Josephine Abbott. She just came to town and she's looking for work. I remembered you saying you could use some help up at your place." Samuel looked at Josephine again, his expression thoughtful. She made herself meet his eyes, though her heart was pounding. She had learned to read men quickly, to spot the signs of anger or cruelty, but she couldn't read this man at all. He was like a wall, solid and impassive. "You know anything about preserving meat and vegetables?" he asked her directly. "Yes, sir." "Can you cook?" "Yes, sir." "Mend clothes and such?" "Yes, sir." He was quiet for a long moment, studying her. Josephine felt her cheeks flush under his scrutiny. Then he said, "It's remote up where I live. Cabin's about 2 hours' ride from town. You'd have your own room and I'd pay you fair wages plus room and board. Work's steady, but it's not easy. I expect things done right, but I'm not unreasonable about it. If you want the job, it's yours." Josephine stared at him. "Just like that, just like that. You don't want references or anything. Do you have references?" "No." "Then I guess we'll skip that part." Something that might have been humor flickered in his gray-green eyes. "I'm a good judge of character, Miss Abbott. You look like someone who needs a fresh start and honest work. I need help. Seems straightforward to me." "When would I start?" she asked, hardly daring to believe this was real. "I'm heading back up the mountain tomorrow morning. You can come with me if you're ready." Josephine thought about the alternatives. She had enough money for maybe 2 more nights in a cheap room if she could find one, and then nothing. She could try to find other work in town, but the reception she had gotten so far didn't suggest much success. And there was always the possibility that Thomas would come looking for her, though she prayed he wouldn't bother. "I'm ready," she said. Samuel nodded once. "Meet me here at dawn tomorrow. Bring whatever you've got. I'll have a horse for you." He turned back to finish his business with the storekeeper, and Martha gently tugged Josephine toward the door. Once they were outside, Martha grinned at her. "See, told you he was decent." "He didn't even ask about my face," Josephine said quietly. "Samuel's not one to pry. But he sees things, I reckon. Understands more than he lets on." Martha squeezed her arm. "You'll be safe with him, Josephine. I truly believe that." Josephine wanted to believe it too, but trust was a luxury she couldn't afford anymore. Still, she had made her choice. Tomorrow, she would ride up into the mountains with a stranger and hope that Martha was right. That night, she slept better than she had in weeks. The next morning, she thanked Martha and Henry for their kindness, promised to visit when she came to town, and made her way to the general store as the sun was just breaking over the horizon. Samuel was waiting with 2 horses, a large bay gelding for himself and a smaller chestnut mare. He helped her tie her carpet bag to the saddle, his hands quick and efficient, then showed her how to mount. He was patient with her awkwardness, his instructions clear and calm. They rode out of Nebraska City as the town was waking up, heading west into the rolling hills. Samuel set an easy pace, and Josephine was grateful. She wasn't used to riding, and her body was still sore from Thomas's last beating. The morning was beautiful, the sky pale blue and the grass green from recent rains. Meadowlarks sang from fence posts, and the air smelled clean and fresh. Samuel didn't talk much as they rode, but his silence wasn't uncomfortable. He pointed out landmarks occasionally so she would know the way, and once he stopped to let the horses drink from a small stream. Josephine dismounted awkwardly, her legs shaky. "You're doing fine," Samuel said quietly. "It gets easier." "I've never ridden much," she admitted. "I figured." He handed her his canteen. "Drink some water." She did, the water cold and sweet. When she handed it back, their fingers brushed briefly. His hands were huge and calloused, but his touch was gentle. She found herself thinking about Martha's words. He's a good man. They continued riding, climbing higher into the hills. The land grew wilder, with fewer signs of settlement. Pine trees began to appear among the cottonwoods and oaks, and the air grew cooler. Finally, after what felt like an eternity to Josephine's aching legs, they crested a rise and Samuel pointed ahead. "There's home," he said simply. The cabin sat in a small valley surrounded by forested hills. It was larger than Josephine had expected, built of solid logs chinked with mud, with a stone chimney rising from one end. There was a barn nearby, a small corral with several horses, and what looked like a smokehouse and root cellar. A clear stream ran through the property, and the whole place had an air of quiet competence. "It's beautiful," Josephine said honestly. Samuel glanced at her, and she saw surprise in his eyes, as if he hadn't expected her to think so. "I like it," he said. "It's peaceful." They rode down to the cabin, and Samuel helped her dismount. Her legs nearly buckled when her feet hit the ground, and he steadied her with one large hand on her elbow until she found her balance. "Sorry," she muttered, embarrassed. "Nothing to be sorry about. Come on, I'll show you inside." The cabin was one large main room with a sleeping loft above. There was a big stone fireplace at one end, a sturdy table and chairs, shelves lined with supplies, and a kitchen area with a good iron stove. Everything was clean and well maintained. Samuel led her to a small room off the main space that held a narrow bed, a chest of drawers, and a washstand. "This will be your room," he said. "I sleep in the loft, so you'll have privacy. There's a lock on the door if you want to use it." Josephine stared at him. A lock. He was offering her a lock, acknowledging without words that she might need protection. From him. The consideration in that gesture nearly undid her. "Thank you," she whispered. He nodded and left her alone to settle in. Josephine sat on the edge of the bed and looked around her small room. It was plain and simple, but it was hers. Safe, private. She thought about the years of sharing a bed with Thomas, always tense, always waiting for his moods to shift. Here she would have a door she could lock, a space that was hers alone. She unpacked her few belongings, hanging her 2 extra dresses on pegs and placing her brush and few toiletries on the washstand. Then she went out into the main room. Samuel was at the kitchen area, pulling supplies from the shelves. "I thought we'd have a simple supper tonight," he said. "I can show you where everything is, and starting tomorrow you can take over the cooking if that suits you." "That suits me fine," Josephine said. "What can I do to help now? You can rest if you need to. That was a long ride." "I'd rather help." He studied her for a moment, then nodded. "All right. There's a pot there. Fill it with water from the bucket and we'll make some coffee." They worked together in silence. Samuel moved around the kitchen with surprising efficiency for such a large man, his movements economical and sure. He cooked beans and bacon, sliced bread, set the table. Josephine helped where she could, learning where things were kept, observing his routines. They ate as the sun set, the cabin filling with warm orange light. Samuel ate steadily, methodically, without the crude table manners Josephine had grown used to with her father and Thomas. When he was finished, he sat back with his coffee and looked at her directly. "I should tell you how things work here," he said. "I'm usually up before dawn. I hunt or trap depending on the season, check my snares, tend the horses. I'll need breakfast before I go out and supper when I come back. During the day, there's cooking, baking, preserving whatever meat or vegetables needed, mending, keeping the cabin clean. The garden out back needs tending too. If something breaks, let me know and I'll fix it. If you need something from town, make a list and I'll get it on my next trip. I go into Nebraska City about once every 2 weeks to trade. Josephine nodded, absorbing all this. What about washing? There's a big kettle outside for heating water. I do my own washing usually, but if you want to include my things with yours, I won't object. I'll pay you $20 a month plus your room and board. If that seems unfair, we can discuss it. $20. It was more than fair. It was generous. Josephine had expected perhaps 10. That's more than fair, Mr. Zane, Samuel, he said. We're going to be living under the same roof. Might as well use first names if you're comfortable with that. Samuel, then, and I'm Josephine, or Josie if you prefer. Josephine suits you, he said quietly. Then he stood, gathering the dishes. I'll wash up tonight since you did the cooking. Tomorrow we'll start fresh. Josephine watched him wash the dishes, his big hands careful with the tin plates. She felt unmoored, as if she had stepped into someone else's life. This man, this stranger, was treating her with a consideration she had never experienced from any man before. He had given her work, shelter, fair pay, a locked door, and hadn't once raised his voice or his hand. Samuel, she said hesitantly. He turned from the dishpan, water dripping from his fingers. Yes, thank you, for giving me this chance. He was quiet for a long moment, his gray-green eyes thoughtful in the lamplight. Everyone deserves a chance, Josephine, he said finally, and everyone deserves to be treated with respect. You'll get both here. That night, Josephine locked her door and climbed into the narrow bed. She could hear Samuel moving around in the main room, then the sound of him climbing the ladder to the loft. The cabin settled into silence, broken only by the creak of wood and the distant call of an owl. For the first time in longer than she could remember, Josephine felt something close to peace. The days fell into a rhythm. Josephine rose early and made breakfast biscuits and gravy, bacon and eggs, strong coffee. Samuel ate without complaint, thanked her quietly, and went out to tend his trap lines or hunt. She spent her days cooking, cleaning, mending his clothes and her own, tending the garden that grew behind the cabin. The work was hard but satisfying in a way her life had never been before. Everything she did mattered, had purpose, and no one criticized or belittled her efforts. Samuel was a man of few words, but the words he did speak were always kind. He never yelled, never complained, never made her feel stupid or worthless. When she overcooked the beans one day, he simply ate them without comment. When she apologized, he shook his head. Food's food, he said. And you've been doing a fine job. One pot of overdone beans doesn't change that. When he asked her to do something, he phrased it as a request, not a command. Would you mind mending this shirt when you have time? Or, if you could make extra biscuits tomorrow, I'd appreciate it. I'll be gone longer than usual. It was such a stark contrast to Thomas's barked orders and her father's drunken demands that sometimes Josephine had to blink back tears. After 2 weeks, the bruises on her face had faded to yellow-green and were starting to disappear. Her split lip had healed. She caught Samuel looking at her one morning as she served breakfast, and his expression was carefully neutral. "You're looking better," he said simply. "The mountain air must agree with you." "I think it does," she replied softly. As the weeks passed, Josephine began to truly settle in. She learned Samuel's routines, his preferences, the rhythm of his days. She learned that he liked his coffee strong and black, that he had a sweet tooth for dried apple pie, that he always cleaned his rifle right after using it, and oiled his boots every Sunday. She learned that he read in the evenings by lamplight, working his way slowly through a small collection of books, and that he whittled when he was thinking, creating small wooden animals that he left on the shelves. She also learned that Samuel was respected in the area. When they occasionally encountered other trappers or hunters passing through, the men greeted him with genuine warmth. They called him fair and honest, someone whose word meant something. She learned that he had lived on this mountain for 5 years, that he had built the cabin himself with his own hands, that he preferred solitude but didn't shun company when it came. What she didn't learn was anything about his past. Samuel never mentioned family or where he had come from. He didn't pry into her history either, though she sometimes caught him watching her with a thoughtful expression, as if he was trying to figure something out. One evening in late summer, a month after she had arrived, they sat on the porch after supper watching the sun set over the mountains. The air was cool and sweet, filled with the scent of pine and wildflowers. Samuel was whittling, long curls of wood falling from his knife, and Josephine was mending one of his shirts. "Can I ask you something?" Samuel said suddenly, Josephine's hands stilled on the fabric. "Yes." "That man who hurt you, he your husband?" She had known this conversation might come eventually, but her throat still tightened. "He was. He know where you are?" "I don't think so. I hope not." Samuel was quiet, his knife moving steadily against the wood. "If he shows up here," he said finally, "he won't take you anywhere you don't want to go. You have my word on that." The certainty in his voice, the quiet promise, made Josephine's eyes burn. "Thank you," she whispered. "No thanks needed." He glanced at her, his gray-green eyes serious. "You're safe here, Josephine. I want you to know that. You're safe." Something shifted in Josephine's chest, something painful and sweet all at once. She looked at this man, this huge, quiet mountain man who had taken her in without questions, who treated her with gentle respect, who made her feel human again. And she realized with a jolt that was half fear and half wonder that she was starting to trust him. "I do know that," she said softly. "I'm starting to believe it." Samuel nodded and went back to his whittling, but Josephine saw the small smile that touched his lips before he bent his head. As summer deepened into early autumn, Josephine found herself looking forward to the evenings when she and Samuel sat together. They didn't always talk much, but the silence was comfortable. Sometimes he would tell her about what he had seen during the day: a deer with twin fawns, a golden eagle hunting, a patch of late-blooming wildflowers. His voice when he described these things was gentle, almost reverent, and Josephine learned that beneath his quiet exterior was a man who noticed beauty and appreciated it. She began to tell him things too, small things at first, about the books she had loved reading as a child, about how she had always wanted to learn to bake bread and was proud that she was finally getting good at it, about how she loved the sound of the stream at night. One evening, she told him about her mother. "She was kind," Josephine said quietly, staring at her hands. "Even when my father was at his worst, she tried to shield me. She would sing to me at night old songs she had learned from her mother. I can still hear her voice sometimes." "How long has she been gone?" Samuel asked gently. 10 years. I was 10 when she died. After that, it was just my father and me." She paused. "I married Thomas because I thought anything would be better than staying in that house. I was wrong." "You weren't wrong to want to leave," Samuel said. "You were just unlucky in where you landed." Josephine looked up at him, surprised by the understanding in his voice. "You don't think I should have tried harder, made it work? I think some situations can't be fixed, and staying in them only breaks you more." His eyes held hers. "You were brave to leave, Josephine. A lot of people wouldn't have had the courage." No one had ever called her brave before. She had called herself a coward 100 times for not leaving sooner, for enduring as long as she had. But Samuel saw it differently. He saw strength where she had only seen weakness. "Thank you," she whispered, and meant it with her whole heart. September brought cooler nights and the first touches of gold to the aspen trees on the hillsides. Samuel began preparing for winter, hunting deer and elk to fill the smokehouse, chopping massive amounts of firewood, checking the cabin for any repairs that needed to be made before the snow came. Josephine helped however she could, preserving meat, drying vegetables from the garden, making sure their supplies were well stocked. They worked together easily now, their movements synchronized after months of living in close quarters. Josephine knew when Samuel needed more coffee without him asking. Samuel knew when she was tired and would take over the heavier tasks without being prompted. It was a partnership built on mutual respect and consideration, and Josephine treasured it more than she had ever treasured anything. One cool morning in mid-September, Samuel came back from checking his trap lines earlier than usual. Josephine was kneading bread dough when he walked in, and she looked up in surprise. "Everything all right?" she asked. "Everything's fine." He hesitated, then said, "I was thinking. You've been here almost 4 months now, and you haven't been back to town once. If you'd like to visit Martha or see if there's anything you need, we could ride down today. The weather's good, and I could use a few supplies anyway." Josephine realized he was right. She hadn't left the mountain since she arrived, and she found that she didn't particularly miss town. Still, it would be nice to see Martha and thank her properly for her help. "I'd like that," she said. "Let me finish this bread and we can go." They rode to Nebraska City in the golden autumn sunlight, the horses fresh and eager. Josephine found that she was a much better rider now, her seat more secure, her hands lighter on the reins. Samuel noticed and nodded approvingly. "You've got a good seat now," he said. "Knew you would." In town, they stopped first at Anderson's general store where Samuel conducted his business. Then Josephine went to find Martha while Samuel loaded their supplies. She found Martha hanging laundry behind the sod house, and the other woman's face lit up when she saw her. "Josephine." "Oh, I'm so glad to see you." Martha hugged her tightly. "You look wonderful. The mountain life clearly suits you." They talked for an hour, sitting in Martha's small kitchen with cups of tea. Josephine told her about the cabin, about the work, about how peaceful life was up there. What she didn't say, but what Martha seemed to understand anyway, was how much Samuel's quiet kindness had healed something broken inside her. "He's a good man," Martha said softly. "I'm glad it's working out." "So am I," Josephine admitted. "I can't imagine being anywhere else now." When she met Samuel back at the general store, he had their supplies loaded and was waiting patiently. As they rode out of town, Josephine realized she was eager to get home. Home. When had she started thinking of the cabin as home? That night, after supper, Samuel was unusually quiet. He sat on the porch whittling, but his knife moved more slowly than usual, and his eyes were distant. Josephine finished the dishes and came out to join him, bringing her mending. "Something on your mind?" she asked gently. Samuel was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then he said, "I had a family once, a wife and a baby daughter. This was back in Missouri about 6 years ago." Josephine's hands stilled. Samuel had never spoken about his past before, and she hardly dared to breathe, afraid he would stop. "There was a fever that went through the town," he continued, his voice low and rough. "Took a lot of people. It took my wife Sarah and my little girl Emma. She was only 2 years old." "Oh, Samuel," Josephine whispered, "I'm so sorry. After they died, I couldn't stay there. Everything reminded me of them. So I headed west, kept going until I found this place. Built the cabin, started a new life. I thought I wanted to be alone." He paused, his hands going still on the wood. "But these past months, having you here, it's made me realize I was just hiding. Running from my grief instead of facing it." "There's nothing wrong with needing time alone to heal," Josephine said softly. "Maybe." He looked at her then, and there was something vulnerable in his eyes she had never seen before. "But I'm glad you're here, Josephine. I want you to know that. This cabin feels like a home again instead of just a place to sleep." Josephine's heart was beating very fast. "I'm glad I'm here too," she said. "Gladder than I can say." They sat in the comfortable darkness, the evening sounds of the mountain around them, and something unspoken passed between them. Something that felt like possibility. As autumn deepened and the aspens turned brilliant gold against the evergreen slopes, Josephine found herself increasingly aware of Samuel in ways she hadn't been before. She noticed the way his face softened when he smiled, rare as those smiles were. She noticed the gentleness in his large hands, the careful way he moved around the cabin so as not to crowd her. She noticed the way he looked at her sometimes, when he thought she wasn't watching, with an expression that made her breath catch. She tried to tell herself that what she was feeling was just gratitude. Samuel had given her safety and respect when she had had neither. It was natural to feel warmly toward him, but she knew, deep in her heart, that it was more than gratitude. She was drawn to him, to his quiet strength and innate decency, to the way he saw her as a person rather than as a possession or a target. The realization terrified her. She had sworn after leaving Thomas that she would never let another man close to her, never put herself in a position to be hurt again. But Samuel was nothing like Thomas. He was nothing like her father, and the way he made her feel safe and valued and seen was intoxicating. One evening in late October, the first snow of the season began to fall. Josephine stood on the porch watching the big flakes drift down in the lamplight, transforming the valley into something magical. Samuel came to stand beside her, so close she could feel the warmth radiating from his large frame. "Beautiful, isn't it?" he said quietly. "Yes," she breathed. "I've never seen anything like it." They stood together in silence, watching the snow fall. Then Samuel said, his voice rough and low, "Josephine, I need to tell you something." Her heart jumped. "What is it?" "These past months, getting to know you, seeing you heal and grow stronger, it's meant more to me than I can properly say." He turned to face her, and in the lamplight his eyes were intense. "You've become important to me, more than just someone who works for me. And if I'm reading things wrong, if I'm overstepping, just tell me and we'll never speak of it again. But I think you might feel something too, and I can't keep pretending I don't care for you." Josephine stared up at him, her breath caught in her throat. Samuel cared for her. This strong, gentle man who had shown her more kindness than anyone in her life, he cared for her. The knowledge filled her with warmth and terror in equal measure. "I do feel something," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "But Samuel, I'm afraid. I don't know if I can be what you need. I'm broken in ways you might not understand." "You're not broken," he said firmly, and his large hand came up to gently cup her cheek. The touch was feather light, as if he was afraid she would shatter. "You're hurt, but that's not the same thing, and I'm not asking you to be anything except yourself. I'm just asking if maybe someday you might want to see if we could be more than what we are now." Tears spilled down Josephine's cheeks. She had cried so many tears of pain and fear in her life, but these were different. These were tears of hope, of possibility, of being seen and valued by someone who mattered. "Yes," she whispered. "Someday, maybe someday soon." Samuel's face transformed with his smile, genuine and bright and beautiful. Then, very slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, he leaned down and pressed the gentlest kiss to her forehead. It was chaste and sweet and perfect, and it made Josephine's heart feel like it might burst. They stood together on the porch as the snow continued to fall, and Josephine thought that perhaps this was what healing felt like. Not forgetting the past, but learning that the future might hold something better. Winter came to the mountains with fierce determination. Snow piled high around the cabin, and the temperatures dropped until the stream froze solid. Samuel spent his days hunting, checking trap lines, and making sure they had enough firewood to stay warm. Josephine kept the cabin cozy, cooking hearty meals, baking bread that filled the space with warmth and good smells. They grew closer during those long winter nights. Samuel taught her to play chess using a set he had carved himself, and they would sit by the fire moving pieces while snow howled outside. They talked more, sharing stories from their lives, dreams for the future. Samuel told her about growing up in Tennessee, about learning to hunt and trap from his grandfather, about the years he had worked as a logger before settling in Missouri. Josephine told him about the books she loved, about wanting someday to have a garden full of flowers as well as vegetables, about the small dreams she had nurtured even in the darkest times. And slowly, carefully, they began to touch. Samuel would brush his fingers against hers when they passed dishes at the table. Josephine would rest her hand on his arm when they talked. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Samuel held out his hand and Josephine took it, marveling at how her small hand disappeared into his large one. They sat like that for an hour, just holding hands, and it was one of the sweetest moments of Josephine's life. Christmas came, and Samuel surprised her by riding to town for supplies and coming back with small gifts. A length of blue fabric for a new dress, a silver hairbrush, a book of poetry. Josephine had made him a new shirt, carefully sewn with tiny, even stitches, and when he tried it on and it fit perfectly, the look of pleasure on his face made all the hours of work worthwhile. On Christmas night, they sat together on the small bench by the fire, and Samuel put his arm around her shoulders. Josephine tensed for just a moment, old fears surfacing, but then she relaxed into his warmth. He was solid and safe, and she was learning to believe that he would never hurt her. "Merry Christmas, Josephine," he murmured against her hair. "Merry Christmas, Samuel," she whispered back, and thought that this was the best Christmas she had ever had. As winter slowly gave way to early spring, Samuel's touches became bolder. He would brush Josephine's hair back from her face, his fingers gentle. He would hold her hand openly now, not just in private moments. Once, when she slipped on the icy porch steps, he caught her and held her close for a long moment, and Josephine could feel the rapid beating of his heart against her cheek. "I've got you," he said, and she knew he meant more than just that moment. One evening in March, as the snow was beginning to melt and the days were growing longer, Samuel asked if they could talk. They sat together on the bench by the fire, and he took both her hands in his. "Josephine, I love you," he said simply, his gray-green eyes holding hers. "I think I've loved you since about a month after you arrived, when you laughed at something I said, and I realized I would do just about anything to hear that sound again. I know we come from hard places, both of us. I know trust doesn't come easy. But I want you to know that I will spend every day of my life earning your trust and your love if you'll let me." Josephine's eyes filled with tears. "I love you too," she said, the words feeling strange and wonderful on her tongue. "I was so afraid to feel this way, but I can't help it. You make me feel safe and valued and cherished. You make me feel human again." "You are human," Samuel said fiercely. "You're strong and brave and beautiful, and any man who made you feel otherwise was a fool and a coward." Then he kissed her, really kissed her, his lips gentle on hers. It was nothing like the rough, demanding kisses Thomas had taken from her. This was an offering, a question, a promise. Josephine kissed him back, her hands coming up to rest against his broad chest, feeling the steady thump of his heart. When they pulled apart, both breathing hard, Samuel rested his forehead against hers. "Marry me," he said. Not now, not until you're ready. But someday, when you feel safe enough, marry me. Let me spend my life loving you the way you deserve to be loved." "Yes," Josephine said, and she was smiling through her tears. "Yes, Samuel. When I'm ready, I'll marry you." Spring bloomed across the mountains in an explosion of wildflowers and new green. Josephine worked in the garden, planting vegetables and the flower seeds Samuel had bought for her in town. She watched them grow with a sense of wonder, these living things she was nurturing. Samuel watched her with equally tender attention, and sometimes Josephine would look up from her work to find him standing nearby with such love in his eyes that it took her breath away. They courted properly through the spring and into early summer. Samuel brought her wildflowers and pretty stones from the stream. Josephine baked his favorite foods and mended his clothes with extra care. They took long walks through the mountains, Samuel pointing out wildlife and teaching her about the land. They talked for hours about everything and nothing, learning each other in ways that went deeper than physical touch. And gradually, gently, Josephine healed. The nightmares that had plagued her sleep grew less frequent. She no longer flinched at sudden movements. She learned to trust Samuel's touch, to welcome his embraces, to believe that his love was real and lasting. One evening in July, more than a year after she had first arrived at the cabin, Josephine came out of her small room and found Samuel sitting at the table. He looked up as she entered, and something in her expression made him stand. "I'm ready," she said simply. "I'm ready to marry you, Samuel." His face lit up like the sun breaking through clouds. "You're sure?" "I'm sure." She crossed to him and took his hands. "I trust you completely. I love you with my whole heart. I want to be your wife." Samuel pulled her into his arms, lifting her right off her feet and spun her around. Josephine laughed, the sound bright and free, and realized with a jolt that she was happy. Truly, deeply happy for the first time in her life. They were married 3 weeks later in Nebraska City, with Martha and Henry as witnesses and a circuit preacher officiating. Josephine wore a new dress made from the blue fabric Samuel had given her at Christmas, and she carried wildflowers picked that morning. Samuel wore his best clothes and couldn't stop smiling. When the preacher said they were man and wife, Samuel kissed her gently, reverently, and Josephine thought her heart might burst from joy. This was what marriage was supposed to be, a partnership between equals, built on love and respect and trust. They rode back to the cabin as the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose. Samuel helped Josephine down from her horse, then surprised her by sweeping her up in his powerful arms. "What are you doing?" she laughed. "Carrying my bride over the threshold," he said, grinning. "It's tradition." He carried her into the cabin and set her down gently. Then, his expression growing serious, he cupped her face in his large hands. "I promise you," he said softly, "that I will spend every day of my life making sure you never regret this. I will love you and cherish you and keep you safe. You have my word, Josephine." "And you have mine," she said. "I will love you and stand beside you and make this cabin a home for us both." That night, in the bedroom that had once been hers alone and was now theirs together, Samuel loved her with a gentleness and patience that made her cry. He took his time, learning what she liked, being careful with her, making sure she felt safe and cherished every moment. And when they finally came together as husband and wife, Josephine understood for the first time what it meant to give yourself to someone who truly loved you. Afterward, she lay in Samuel's arms, her head on his broad chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "Thank you," she whispered. "For what?" "For being you, for being gentle, for loving me." Samuel's arms tightened around her. "Thank you for trusting me," he said, "for giving me a chance, for making my life complete again." They fell asleep tangled together, and Josephine's dreams were peaceful. The years that followed were the happiest of Josephine's life. She and Samuel built a life together in their mountain valley, a life of hard work and simple pleasures. They expanded the garden, added chickens to their farm, and Samuel built a larger barn. Josephine learned to shoot and helped with the hunting. Samuel learned to bake bread almost as well as she did. In the spring of 1874, Josephine realized she was pregnant. She told Samuel one morning over breakfast, and he went absolutely still, his coffee cup halfway to his lips. "You're sure?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. "I'm sure." He set down his cup very carefully, then came around the table and knelt beside her chair. He laid his hand gently on her still flat stomach, his eyes shining with tears. "We're going to have a baby," he said wonderingly. "We are." Josephine covered his hand with hers. "Are you happy?" Happy doesn't begin to cover it. He looked up at her, and she saw joy and fear and hope all mixed in his expression. "I lost a child once. The thought of having another chance at being a father, it's more than I ever dared hope for." Their son was born in December, during the first major snowstorm of the winter. Martha came up from town to help with the birth, and Samuel wore a path in the cabin floor with his pacing. When the baby finally arrived, healthy and squalling, Samuel held him with such tender care that Josephine fell in love with her husband all over again. They named him William, after Samuel's grandfather, and he was a perfect blend of both his parents. He had Samuel's gray-green eyes and Josephine's delicate features. Samuel was a devoted father, gentle and patient, and watching him with their son made Josephine's heart overflow with love. 2 years later, they had a daughter they named Rose, for the wild roses that grew near the cabin. She was tiny and fierce, with dark hair like Samuel's and a will of iron. Samuel doted on her shamelessly, this big mountain man wrapped around his baby daughter's tiny finger. Life wasn't always easy. There were hard winters when supplies ran low, summers when the heat made everyone irritable, illnesses that scared them both. But they faced everything together, Samuel and Josephine, partners in all things. And through it all, Samuel never once raised his voice to her in anger, never lifted his hand except to help or to hold, never made her feel anything less than loved and valued. On their 5th wedding anniversary, as they sat on the porch watching their children play in the summer evening, Josephine turned to Samuel. "Do you remember the day we met?" she asked. "Every detail," Samuel said. "You looked so scared and so brave all at once." "I knew right then that you were special." "I was terrified of you," Josephine admitted. "You were so big and strong, and I had learned that men like that were dangerous. And now I know that true strength is gentle," she said softly. "You taught me that, Samuel. You taught me that love doesn't have to hurt, that a man can be powerful and kind at the same time." Samuel took her hand, his thumb stroking over her knuckles. "You taught me that my heart wasn't dead," he said, "that I could love again, that I could have a family again. You brought me back to life, Josephine." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching William chase butterflies and Rose toddle after him on unsteady legs. Then Josephine said, "I've been thinking about something." "What's that?" "I want to do something for women like I was. Women who are running from bad situations and need help. Maybe we could offer the cabin as a safe place, or help them find work, or just be there if they need someone." Samuel looked at her with such pride and love that it took her breath away. "I think that's a wonderful idea," he said. "We have plenty of room, and Lord knows there are women who need what we can offer. Let's talk to Martha next time we're in town. She'll know who needs help." And so they did. Over the years, their cabin became known as a place where women could find refuge and a fresh start. Some stayed for a few weeks, some for months. Samuel treated them all with the same gentle respect he showed Josephine, and she helped them heal and find their strength. Some of the women moved on to other places and new lives. Others settled nearby, becoming part of the small community that grew around Nebraska City. Through it all, Samuel and Josephine's love only deepened. They had their disagreements, of course, but they worked through them with communication and respect. Samuel never forgot the broken woman who had arrived at his cabin that first summer, and he made sure that Josephine knew every single day that she was loved. Josephine never forgot the gentle mountain man who had given her a chance when no one else would, and she made sure Samuel knew that he was her home, her heart, her everything. The years rolled on, and their family grew. William grew tall and strong like his father, with the same quiet competence and gentle strength. Rose grew into a spirited young woman who was afraid of nothing. They had 2 more children, another son named Henry after Martha's husband, and a daughter named Sarah after Samuel's first wife. Samuel had wept when Josephine suggested the name, touched beyond words that she would honor his lost family that way. Their cabin was always full of life and laughter, of hard work and simple joys. Samuel taught his sons to hunt and trap and respect the land. Josephine taught her daughters to be strong and independent, to never let anyone make them feel less than they were. Together, they built a legacy of love and kindness that spread far beyond their mountain valley. One evening, many years after that first summer, Samuel and Josephine sat together on the porch watching the sunset. Their children were grown now, with families of their own, though they visited often. Samuel's hair was streaked with silver, and Josephine had lines around her eyes from years of smiling. But when Samuel looked at her, he still saw the brave young woman who had arrived with bruises on her face and fear in her eyes. And when Josephine looked at him, she still saw the gentle giant who had spoken kindly to her when she had never heard a kind word from any man. "No regrets?" Samuel asked, taking her hand. "Not a single one," Josephine said, and she was smiling. That smile that Samuel had worked so hard to earn that first summer, the smile that meant she felt safe and loved and happy. "You gave me everything, Samuel. A home, a family, a life worth living. You taught me what love really means." "You gave me just as much," Samuel said. "You brought light back into my life when I thought I would live in darkness forever. You made me whole again." They sat together as the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, 2 people who had found each other when they both needed it most. The mountain breeze was soft and cool, carrying the scent of pine and wildflowers, and from inside the cabin they could hear the sounds of their grandchildren visiting, playing and laughing. Josephine leaned her head on Samuel's broad shoulder, and he wrapped his arm around her, holding her close. "I love you," she said softly. "I love you too," Samuel replied. "Always have, always will." And as the night deepened around them, Josephine thought about that terrified young woman who had climbed down from a stagecoach so many years ago, certain that life held nothing good for her. She thought about the mountain man who had offered her work and safety without asking for anything in return. She thought about the long journey from fear to trust, from pain to healing, from loneliness to love. She had never heard a kind word from any man until the day Samuel Zane spoke gently to her, and that gentleness had changed everything. It had saved her life and given her a future she could never have imagined. It had taught her that goodness existed in the world, that not all men were cruel, that love could heal even the deepest wounds. Years later, when their grandchildren asked Josephine about her life, about how she and Grandpa Samuel had met, she would tell them the story. She would tell them about arriving in Nebraska City with nothing but bruises and fear, about meeting a mountain man who treated her with respect when no one else would, about learning to trust and love again. And she would tell them the most important part. that kindness matters, that gentle words can change lives, that treating people with dignity and respect, especially when they are at their lowest, can make all the difference in the world. "Your grandfather saved me," she would say, not with grand gestures or dramatic rescues, but with simple kindness. He spoke gently when the world had been harsh. He offered safety when I had known nothing but fear. He showed me that love doesn't have to hurt, that it can heal instead. Samuel would always blush when she told this story, uncomfortable with being called a hero. But Josephine knew the truth. He was her hero, her savior, her greatest love. And she spent every day of their long life together making sure he knew how much he meant to her. They grew old together in their mountain cabin, surrounded by the family they had built and the love they had nurtured. When Samuel finally passed, many years later, Josephine held his hand and told him one last time how much she loved him, how grateful she was for every moment they had shared. And Samuel's last words to her were the same ones he had spoken so many times over the decades. "You're safe, Josephine. You're loved. Always." Josephine lived a few more years after Samuel died, staying in the cabin they had shared, tended by her children and grandchildren. She would sit on the porch in the evenings, watching the sun set over the mountains, and remember the life she had lived. The fear and pain of her early years had faded to distant memories, overshadowed by decades of love and joy. When she finally joined Samuel, it was peacefully in her sleep, with a smile on her face. Her children buried her beside him on the hill overlooking the valley, under the pine trees where wildflowers bloomed every spring. On her headstone, they carved simple words that told the whole story. Josephine Zane, beloved wife, mother, and friend, she found love and safety in the mountains 1852, 1929. And beside it, Samuel's stone reed. Samuel Zane, beloved husband, father, and friend, he spoke gently and changed a life 1847-1925. The cabin stood for many more years, passed down through the generations, always a place of love and safety. And the story of Samuel and Josephine became a family legend, told and retold, a reminder that kindness can change the world, that gentle words can heal broken hearts, and that love, real love, is built on respect and trust, and the choice to see the best in each other every single day. In the end, Josephine's life was proof that no matter how dark the beginning, there can be light ahead. That even when you've never heard a kind word from any man, there might be one man out there who will speak gently and teach you to smile again. And that when you find that person, that safe harbor in the storm, the love you build together can transform everything. The mountain man and the broken woman who found each other that summer day in 1872 built something beautiful together. They built a family, a home, a legacy of kindness. And though they are long gone now, their story lives on, a testament to the healing power of love and the difference one person's gentleness can make in another person's life. Josephine had arrived at Samuel's cabin expecting nothing more than temporary work and shelter. She had left behind a life of pain and fear, certain that she would never truly feel safe or loved. But Samuel, with his quiet strength and gentle words, had given her everything. He had given her safety and respect and love. He had given her a reason to smile again. He had given her a life. And in return, Josephine had given Samuel a reason to open his heart again after loss. She had filled his cabin with laughter and warmth. She had given him children and partnership and the kind of love that lasts a lifetime. Together, they had created something precious and rare, a marriage built on mutual respect, trust, and the choice to be kind to each other every single day. Their story was not one of grand drama or sweeping adventure. It was quieter than that, more intimate. It was the story of two wounded people who found each other and chose to heal together. It was the story of how a few kind words can change everything, how gentleness can be more powerful than force, how love can grow in the most unexpected places. And it was the story of a smile, that first real smile Josephine had given Samuel after weeks of careful healing. The smile that told him she was beginning to feel safe, beginning to trust, beginning to hope. That smile had been worth waiting for, and Samuel had spent the rest of his life earning it again and again. In the mountains of Nebraska, where the pine trees stand tall and the streams run clear, the memory of Samuel and Josephine still lingers. Their descendants still tell the story of how they met, how they fell in love, how they built a life together. And when people ask what the secret was to their lasting love, the answer is always the same: kindness, respect, gentleness, the willingness to see past the bruises to the person beneath, the courage to trust again after betrayal, the commitment to treat each other with love and dignity every single day. Samuel had never needed Josephine to be anything other than who she was. He had accepted her with all her fears and scars, and he had loved her faithfully until his last breath. Josephine had given Samuel the same gift: acceptance, love, and the knowledge that he was valued for exactly who he was. Together, they had proven that the best love stories are not about perfection. They are about two imperfect people who choose each other, who work through their fears and doubts, who build something strong and lasting through countless small acts of kindness and care. And it all started with a mountain man who spoke gently to a woman who had never heard a kind word from any man. That single act of compassion had rippled out across decades, affecting not just Samuel and Josephine but their children and grandchildren, and all the women they helped over the years. One moment of kindness, multiplied and magnified, had changed countless lives. The sun sets over the mountains now just as it did then, painting the sky in gold and rose. The cabin where Samuel and Josephine lived and loved still stands, lovingly maintained by their descendants. And sometimes, in the quiet of a summer evening, you can almost hear the echo of laughter, the murmur of gentle voices, the sound of a life well lived and a love well earned. This is the story of how Josephine Abbott became Josephine Zane, how a broken woman found healing, how a grieving man found joy again. It is a story of the American West, of hard work and simple pleasures, of building a life in the wilderness. But most of all, it is a love story, one that reminds us that the most powerful force in the world is not violence or cruelty, but kindness. The simple, profound act of treating another human being with gentleness and respect. Samuel and Josephine would be pleased to know that their story is still told, that their legacy of kindness lives on. They would be proud of the family they created, the lives they touched, the love they shared. And they would want others to know that no matter how dark your past, no matter how broken you feel, there is always hope for healing, for happiness, for love. All it takes is one person willing to speak gently, to offer kindness without conditions, to see your worth when you cannot see it yourself. And if you are that person for someone else, if you choose to offer compassion instead of judgment, gentleness instead of harshness, you might just change a life. Samuel Zane changed Josephine Abbott's life with his gentle words and patient kindness. And Josephine, in turn, changed his, bringing light and love back into a heart that had been closed by grief. Together, they proved that healing is possible, that love can grow even from the darkest beginnings, and that a life built on mutual respect and tender care is the greatest adventure of all. Their story ends not with drama but with peace: two people who loved each other well, who raised a family together, who made their corner of the world a better place. They lived fully, loved deeply, and left behind a legacy that continues to inspire. In the mountains of Nebraska, where Samuel and Josephine built their life together, the wildflowers still bloom every spring. The streams still run clear and cold. The pine trees still stand tall against the sky. And somewhere in that valley, in the cabin where two wounded souls found healing and love, their story lives on a testament to the transforming power of gentleness, the strength found in kindness, and the miracle that happens when someone speaks gently to a heart that has known only harshness. Josephine had never heard a kind word from any man until Samuel Zane. But that mountain man spoke gently, offered safety, and showed her what love could be. And because of him, she finally smiled, truly smiled for the first time in her life. That smile was the beginning of everything, of healing, of trust, of a love that would last a lifetime and beyond. And so their story concludes, not with an ending but with a legacy. The love Samuel and Josephine shared continues in their descendants, in the values they passed down, in the cabin that still stands as a reminder that kindness matters, that gentleness has power, and that love, real, lasting, transformative love, is always worth believing in, always worth fighting for, and always worth the risk of opening your heart one more time.